This is Living Catholic with Father Don Wolf. Living Catholic is a fresh look at issues confronting each of us today. This show deals with living Catholic, what that means for Catholics, as well as the impact on the rest of society. You certainly don't have to be Catholic to enjoy this show. And now your host, Father Don Wolf.
Hello, Oklahoma. This is, I can get it straight here. Welcome, Oklahoma, to Living Catholic. I'm Father Don Wolf, pastor of Sacred Heart Parish and rector of the Shrine of Blessed Stanley Rother. And we celebrate this Easter week, Christ risen from the dead, who broke the power of death. This is the claim we celebrate as the basis of the faith. If Jesus is not raised from the dead, says St. Paul, our faith is in vain. And for the next many weeks, we'll be reading the accounts of Jesus' appearances following Easter Sunday. Over and over again, Jesus appeared to his disciples resurrected. As he did, they struggled to understand what they were seeing. In the midst of identifying him as the Jesus they had seen die on the cross, they also struggled to understand what his resurrection meant. In fact, the rest of the New Testament, following the accounts of the crucifixion and the resurrection, is the account of discovering the meaning of Jesus' rising from the dead. There are several details in the descriptions we have in the New Testament concerning those who saw and interacted with Jesus following the resurrection. Some of them seem contradictory, while all of them seem puzzling. This shouldn't be a surprise. What do we have to compare the resurrection to? No doubt part of the puzzlement has to do with the limitations in language of what the apostles and disciples actually were seeing. And no doubt they struggled to put down on paper what their reactions were and how they made sense of them. Not only that, those descriptions are frustratingly brief. Only a few pages of the Gospels deal with Jesus' appearances. You could read them all in just a few minutes. We all wish there were more, but we do have some idea of what the experience of the resurrected Christ was like. First of all, we should detail the fact that no one saw the resurrection. There were no witnesses to Jesus rising from the dead. In the Gospels, there are details about earthquakes and lightning flashes and the stone being rolled away by angels. But all this is to reveal the tomb empty. In fact, the thaumaturgy highlights the opposite of witnessing the resurrection. They highlight instead the fact that when the women at the tomb looked inside, Jesus' body wasn't there. If you had watched through the night on Holy Saturday, you would have seen nothing, at least according to the stories. Whatever took place as Jesus rose, it wasn't witnessed. Importantly, it was neither witnessed by the guards who were tasked to watch there through the night. What the stories testify to is the appearance of the resurrected Jesus, not to the moment of the resurrection. In the movie The Passion of the Christ, there is the brief moment in the closing scene in which a light appears through a crack in the seal between the stone rollover to cover the tomb and the tomb entrance. And in the light shining there, we see the burial cloth fall away, as if what it is lying on is no longer there. It's an artistic representation allowing our imagination to fill in the blanks. Jesus rose and the triumph of light over darkness was accomplished. As far as what happened, we don't know if there's any reason for us to know more. Given what we have, the testimony of those who saw, there's nothing much more to say. Over the last several years, a great deal has been made of the Shroud of Turin. It is reputed to be the burial cloth of Jesus preserved through the centuries. It was regarded for most of its provenance as simply one more relic. It had been guarded for a long time and venerated as any other relic, and otherwise treated as part of the collection of reliquaria. For a long time, it was also regarded with high suspicion. In the general dismissal of all care and concern for the ideas and practices of the age of the faith. It was treated as the product of the gullibility of those in the previous epoch who were liable to believe in anything and so believed in everything, so people said. Until, that is, modern analytical techniques were applied to the image on the cloth, and interesting and complicated results were achieved. Since then, the image on the cloth has been subjected to exhaustive analyses and has produced some startling results. Although it is unquestionably old, it seems to hold within it evidence that is hard to dismiss as faked or illusionary. The most startling has been the intricate analytical technology able to reproduce a 3D version of the image on the cloth. Nobody knows exactly what the relic means. It is safe to say that no one knows how it was produced, how such information as on the cloth came to be, or what its preservation indicates. All we can do is wonder at it. Clearly, it is intriguing. It is not the object of faith, however. While it seems to become more and more an object of indisputable interest, even maybe an expression of intricate, embedded signaling of a reality we should pay attention to, it is no proof of resurrection. That Jesus rose from the dead by the power of the Father and was seen by witnesses who testified as to their encounter with him, that's the object of the faith. If the shroud is authentically the burial cloth of Jesus, forever transformed by the moment of resurrection, then so be it. Were it proved to be an intricate fake, it wouldn't change the truth of the resurrection as an object of our faith. We can allow it to be a comforting affirmation of the logic of belief. And while we do, we can affirm that we comfortably believe that which has been handed down to us, that Jesus, the Son of God, indeed rose from the dead at the hand of his loving Father. Secondly, those who saw the risen Lord, they had a hard time recognizing him. We should also appreciate their conundrum in this manner as well. What else would they compare him to? No one has seen a resurrected person. How are they going to understand what they're seeing? Now, there is some confusion on this point. When they saw Jesus, his wounds were still intact. In fact, his validation of his identity was to point to the wounds that he still had. They had not gone away, nor were they lessened. In John's gospel, the disciples are directed to see the marks of the nails in his hands and the place where the lance entered his side. He could prove it was he, the Lord of life, risen from the dead, because they could just believe their own eyes. It was he, just as they had seen him last. Now that's terrifying, if for no other reason than that the wounds of his hands and feet and side were only the most marked of the wounds he had received. He had been beaten savagely by the soldiers who knew how to make people suffer. The whips used on him were made to tear open the flesh on his back and his sides. Remember how Jesus looked as he carried his cross in the movie, The Passion of the Christ? That was an effort to depict how someone would appear after having received the blows he had been sentenced to prior to the crucifixion. They were awful. If those wounds were intact, it would be hard to look at him. Perhaps he was hard to look at, precisely because those wounds were still there. His flesh was shredded and torn. We recoil at the people who stand at intersections and ask for money. They're unsightly in their torn clothes and their hard stares and their dirty faces. We hardly look at them at all, much less study their looks. It would be easy to overlook someone we actually knew who was standing on the street corner in that situation because we would strive not to look at them. It may have been much the same with Jesus present on Easter Sunday. What we do know is that those who knew him best had a hard time recognizing him. There is, of course, the question of exactly what they were seeing of the Jesus they knew. It is somewhat complicated to explain, but the complication contributes to the challenge they all faced as they encountered the one risen from the dead. So let us try a thought experiment. When we encounter anyone, what is it that we're seeing? If it's, say, Mr. Smith from down the street, who sits on the third pew on the right-hand side on Sunday morning, we see him, Mr. Smith, as he appears to us. We see his 60 years of life on his face, the gray hair at his temples, and the slight bulge at his belt. This is the Mr. Smith we've seen for the last, 5 years or so, every Sunday in his familiar place. If we were to see him in any other context, we'd recognize who he is. He is, after all, Mr. Smith. But of course, we're only seeing him as we see him today. If we could somehow run into him when he was a young second lieutenant in the Army, when he was 22, whip thin, strong, and upright, we might not recognize him at all. Or if we were to look at him on his wedding day, we might need some time to translate what we're seeing at that moment with what we know about him now. If we had the power to fire up our time machine and look back even farther to the Mr. Smith at, say, 8 years old or 6 months old, we'd have an even harder time recognizing him. Eventually, we'd know and recognize them all. In fact, we could delight in seeing the changes that he had undergone and even be more delighted at what had not changed in all the years of his life. But it would take some time to complete the process. We know the 60-year-old is only the latest version of his life. He's come to this state only as the product of all the other stages of his life that he's gone through. When the disciples saw the risen Lord, who were they seeing? Was it the Jesus whom they had last seen at the Last Supper? Or were they seeing a body risen in glory that transcended all they knew and all they could identify at any given moment because it was the sum of what he was at every moment? Seeing someone in the totality of life all at once is what we do when we see anyone. That is to say, everyone appears as the product of who they are and who they have been throughout their lives. The Mr. Smith of 60 years got to look the way he looks only because he lived those years in their totality. But if we were to see the whole of Mr. Smith, unbounded by the limits of time and mortality, then we'd see someone who contained everything that he was and will be, and containing it all at once. And if that's the case, we might not recognize him at all. It would seem the disciples, seeing Jesus in all his glory, faced the same challenge. When they looked and saw, they didn't know exactly who they were seeing. His appearance was unclear to them. They didn't just see his wounds, but his wounds were there. They didn't just notice the person they had last looked upon on the cross or at the Last Supper or mounted on the donkey as he entered Jerusalem a few days before. In his resurrected body, he was all he had been and all he was to be. And since they were used to looking only at the small slice of his life at the moment, they didn't recognize him. In fact, in all of the appearance stories, each person who encounters him needs a kind of prompt to recognize him. He's there, and yet he's not available to them. And it seems to be the case that he's not hiding from them or that he is deliberately keeping them from knowing who he was or uncaring, and they're not uncaring of what they see. Jesus isn't in disguise. Like anyone whom we would see only as the whole of their person, someone who has embodied all there is to see of them at one moment, they had difficulty knowing what or who they were seeing at that moment. Significantly, they did come to know who he was, but it took some doing. There was a prompt from someone or something that allowed them to conclude the one they were seeing was he. His voice, his gesture, a familiar movement, they all helped the disciples to know him. This isn't so miraculous or peculiar. How many times have we needed some prompt to recognize someone in unfamiliar circumstances? We often have to be jarred into recognition when it should have been obvious from the start, but it wasn't. He wanted also to be known. Although it took some doing, he wanted it to be the case that they did come to know it was he. That may sound odd, but he does want his disciples to know of the resurrection and that his resurrected state is the real one. It could have been the case that, as in stories of revenge and punishment, the one who's unknown can skulk and insinuate in his alias and milk every opportunity to come to know what's going on because nobody knows it is he. The hero Ulysses when he came back home, Henry V the night before battle, the spirit form of the he who is not to be named in Harry Potter. They all want to use their lack of recognition to their advantage. Jesus, on the other hand, wants to be known. Significantly, he also wants us to understand how he is to be known. In the story of the disciples on the way to Emmaus, the whole point of the story is how he might be recognized. Indeed, all day long on the journey, the disciples didn't recognize him, although he interacts with them intently as they discuss and argue about the true identity of the Messiah. It's only when they're at table together, when he takes the bread and breaks it, do they recognize him for who he truly is. This is a reminder to us of how he is seen. He is to be seen in the breaking of bread together. This isn't a hint, it's an instruction. We come to know Jesus in the Eucharist we celebrate, and we know him not as memory or not through our nostalgia, but as a living presence accompanying us. The resurrected Jesus is to be a character in our lives. His message to those whom he encounters is also an interesting element of their encounter with him. He instructs them that he will proceed to Galilee, and they are to find him there. That's the message given by the young man whom the women find in the tomb in Mark's gospel. And in Luke's gospel, Jesus tells his disciples he will go on first, and they are to follow him there. And since they're all from there, he's instructing them that they will find him at home. This message is more than simply nailing down a geographical location where they can meet him. It's a revelation about the context of their encounter. They are to find him at home. The familiar places and the common landscape of life is where he is to be found. They don't have to go to the center of religious life in Judea, the temple in Jerusalem. They don't have to head to Rome or travel across the sea or enter into the arcane and the unknown in order to find God's initiative at work in their lives. All they have to do is to return home. And when they do, they'll find him there. The resurrected Christ is to be found wherever we are. This is the greatest of the revelations that he came to share with them. When the Oklahomans became excited about going to Guatemala and opened a mission there, they wanted to bring the message of Christ to those who most needed to hear it. And there in Guatemala, in Santiago Atitlan, they had gone without a pastor for 100 years, and the light of faith had dimmed in the syncretism and ignorance and poverty of the place. The arrival of the Oklahomans and all their can-do Yankee spirit and Catholic elan would bring the message of Christ in its fullness to them. That's what the Oklahomans thought. And when they arrived, they began their work there, and they made a huge discovery. And it was that Christ had preceded them. Jesus was there to be encountered in their missionary work. In fact, the greatest missionary insight was that the promise of encountering Christ there was a gift given to all of them. The risen Christ is to be found wherever we can touch base with what is home for us. In that great book by Walter Chizik that's now recovered its renown through the Hollow app this Lent, Father Chizik describes in that book his missionary journey into the Soviet Union from 1939 to 1963. He called it revealingly, "With God in Russia." He was there to testify that there is no place where God is not even the Gulag. There was also the great final message of Christ to his apostles when he gave the commission to go out to all the world to preach the gospel and to baptize. They took him seriously. The message of Christ did spread, and it spread like wildfire all through the empire at near record speed. Within the first generation, there were Christian communities in virtually every large city along the Mediterranean. But it wasn't simply a travel itinerary. Jesus was giving to his friends from backwater Galilee. He was giving them the invitation to bring the message of God in the world to the world, including to every part of their lives. The resurrection is the promise of God to break the bonds of death in every part of every life, including the interior life of each person. When we're invited beyond the boundaries of life, everything of life becomes different. The disciples of Jesus were those who lived differently. And this is the power of the resurrection. Were it simply the case that a man who once was dead came back to life, the message of Jesus would be no more powerful than the message of Lazarus. Stories of those who came back from the dead to bring a message to the living, those stories are as old as humanity. In fact, there are those who feel comfortable dismissing the story of Jesus as one more iteration of this old theme, one more hero who braved the dark halls of death to return with a new hope for his friends. For them, these people, Jesus is just one more myth. But Jesus didn't just appear back from an unfortunate afternoon outside the walls of Jerusalem. The disciples, when they saw him, weren't just encountering a revivified acquaintance. They saw something different, and they knew that it was different from the beginning. Jesus had come back from the dead, newly alive. His presence was not simply to fill the footprints of familiarity. It was to invite them into a new life, completely beyond the boundaries of their doubt. Jesus had been given a whole new kind of life. For those who encountered him and for those who believed in him, this is the life we're all promised. It's the fullness of life given to Adam in the garden, the ultimate destination to which we are all entrusted. It's not a participation in the right idea or the correct way of thinking, nor is it that we might have our foot in the promise of what's next for humanity. What it is the fulfillment of God's promise to humanity, to lift us beyond the limitations of our lives, to cast into the cruelness of our world, and to bring us into our right future united with God. When the women and the disciples encountered Jesus resurrected, more than anything else, they wanted to be in his presence and they wanted to be with him. This desire accounts for their subsequent history. They traveled the world bringing the message of Christ to all whom they encountered. They bore the burden of making him known in different languages and cultures. Privation, imprisonment, torture, misunderstanding, and eventually execution. Those were the outcome of their mission. And yet they embraced it with all of the enthusiasm and all of the conviction they could find. Their glimpse of the risen Lord, that was enough. That they would become as he was, that was enough for them. And the final overwhelming experience of encountering the risen Lord is the promise that the presence of Christ is not limited to the pages of the Scriptures. In subsequent accounts, for example, he appears to Saul. There are other hints in Paul's letters that others have seen Jesus beside the characters in the stories we have in the Gospels. And all throughout history, there have been those accounts of the saints to whom Jesus has appeared. But beyond the extraordinary, we also know that the presence of Christ is not limited to whomever might have sight of him. We're promised the presence of Jesus when we celebrate the Eucharist. As on the first day of the week when the disciples are gathered together, he can appear among us through the sacramental disclosure of his presence among us. If that seems too abstract, look around when we're gathered the next time. Ask yourself where the resurrected Christ is present. He also promises that when we touch the raised hands of those in need, it is he whom we're serving. Indeed, wherever two or three are gathered, we're to find him in our midst. Perhaps we've not been schooled in seeing him. Indeed, we might be as the disciples were. We simply have to be reminded that it is he who is present, really, in our midst. Over the course of years, I've wondered if Jesus has not been present with us at Mass, not just in the sacramental experience, but in his resurrected presence, alive among us. If I expected him to be there, would I have been more open in seeing him? I wonder. I do know, as I have witnessed the charity and joy and hope in so many, that they bring his presence to me. I come to think that, after all, we're here because every day, really, is Easter Sunday. Back in just a moment. Welcome back to our final segment. We have a poem today called In the Morning Light. Silently they came to the silent cave, knowing not what mystery they would find, each ready to push past the dark and save what memory would blindly leave behind. They, each group, crept closer in the darkness through the glow of intensifying light, till they looked to see in all their starkness the promises pushing them through the night. One, the gathered band of hard, cautious men, had heard a prophecy mid glowing stars, and with fading bravado looked, saw, then laughed. This was the king's royal palace afar. A child swaddled, his mother sat close by, a father sheepish as the baby nursed. The Savior, contented, gurgled and sighed. His full delight conquered the devil's worst. And these men returned to their fields and flocks to give stunned thanks and share glorious praise. A cave, hard hewn from such unyielding rock, yields a glimpse to unveil God's ways. The other band, they, women all, arrived as dawning day filled the hard horizon. To their lords, their friends, new grave they apprised. The stone had been moved, the clothes he died on. It was ripped away and neat folded up, placed on the ledge where he was to lie. The body gone, his empty precious husk disappeared, as finally as a sigh. They cried out the tomb had been robbed, their work to hold and anoint taken from them. Their determination escaped in sobs, the growing light of morning growing dim. Until a voice whispered a message, not here. The one you seek walks Galilee's hills. Alive, more than alive, heaven draws near as he moves again in his Father's will. He's to be found there. If you leave here now and go to the promise of Israel, a new placed revolution, a new vow. Find him there where living will not dim or fail. And they turn back to carry on their day, puzzled, breathless, imagining anew all that living would carry away if he were risen. All weakness gone, too. Each one turned to charge each sleeping face. By her shouts of truth no one would believe. The good news of God's own heavenly pace, cantering faster than any could perceive. At turning away from all things made new, and spoiled all love and life outgiven. Now there was life, and not for the few, but for all who had tried and striven. The morning's stilted silence was no more. The beat of angel wings preceded. All those entering the new open door went forth. Darkness gone, a new day proceeded. That's In the Morning Light. In the weeks to come, I hope that we can together explore what it means to be living Catholic.
Living Catholic is a production of Oklahoma Catholic Radio. To learn more, visit okcr.org.